Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us to today's program on engaging North Korea. My name is Nikita Desai. I'm the Director for Policy and Corporate Programs here at the Korea Society. And with headlines on the imminent nuclear launch ahead of the Kim Il-sung's birthday anniversary on April 15th, I think this is the perfect timing for us to have this program and the perfect speaker for us to have as well. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephan Haggard. He's the Lawrence and Sally Krauss Professor of the Korea Pacific Studies. He's also the Director of the Korea Pacific Program and a Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. He works on political economy of developing countries with a particular interest in Asia and the Korean Peninsula. He's written extensively on political economy of North Korea with Marcus Noland of the Peterson Institute. He's also the editor of the Journal of East Asian Studies and the author of a forthcoming book, Hard Target, Engaging North Korea. And it's also my pleasure to introduce our president, Thomas Byrne, our new president, I should say. He joined us in August of last year after a longstanding career at Moody's. So please give them both a warm welcome. Thank you.
Well, I'll start off. This is actually the first time I met Stephan. Read a lot about him, and his colleague at the Peterson Institute in Washington I know very well, Mark Nolan. So it's really a double pleasure to have Steph here. I'd like to start with the title. The title of Steph's talk today is Engaging North Korea, but I understand, as Nikki just said, that your upcoming book is actually Hard Target, Engaging North Korea. But before I knew that the hard target was in the title, I was wondering, well, to me the title makes sense grammatically because engaging is a gerund, a verbal noun expressing uncompleted action, and I thought that was good. But then metaphorically, of course, what came to mind, I don't think I was the only one, is Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. It's the waiting is the same grammatical structure. And of course, you all, or I think just about everyone knows that Waiting for Godot is an absurdist play written by Samuel Beckett, in which two characters, Vladimir and Estragon, wait endlessly and in vain for the arrival of someone named Godot. The first performance was January 1953, just when the armistice was signed. So, Steph, if I could say, will Engaging North Korea have a different outcome than Samuel Beckett's play? What are the signs that we should be looking for to see whether North Korea is getting serious about engagement with the outside world?
So I think I'll just go ahead and talk on that question for 20, 25 minutes or so. And then is that the way we can proceed? Or is that the way you wanted to do it? Or did you want to?
I'll interrupt you in 5 or 10 minutes. I wanted to ask about economic reform, China's sanctions and things like that, the May Party Congress. But go ahead.
Okay. I'm sorry. I was a little confused about the format. I thought I was going to say a few things, and then we can have our discussion. So let me just say a little bit about myself. I started working on North Korea, studying the famine, and that's influenced a lot of my thinking about the way the country's evolved. And then we moved on to work on refugees, doing surveys of refugees, surveys of firms doing business in North Korea, both Chinese and South Korean firms, and tracking the leadership. But I think for some time, to answer the question that's posed, we've been stuck in a kind of debate about economic statecraft towards North Korea, and particularly the question of how and whether sanctions or various forms of inducements towards North Korea would in fact work, and what we even mean by them working. And I think that debate is on us again, because on the one hand, we have Resolution 2270, and we have the executive order of the United States, 13722, which implements sanctions legislation that the U.S. Congress has passed. But on the other hand, I think we all know in our hearts that countries don't unilaterally disarm. I mean, it just doesn't happen. And so the idea that somehow we're going to squeeze North Korea and North Korea is going to magically give up its nuclear weapons is a fantasy. And what that means is that the process and the interaction between sanctions and whatever inducements we have in offer ultimately has as its objective getting back to the six-party talks. So let me just say a few things, and then we can pick up the conversation from some of the questions that you posed. And I wanted to do that by just looking at a little data on North Korea's observed commercial merchandise trade. And the first thing, and I'll nest this in some discussion periodically on what is said with some data that might be helpful to answering these questions. But the first thing to note is the nuclear crisis is typically dated to October 2002. And notice that throughout this entire period, despite multilateral sanctions, basically there's been this steady upturn in North Korea's trade with the rest of the world. And the other thing that those of you who are economists or had some economics notice is that there's a balance there's a current account deficit here as well. That is, the imports from the rest of the world are exceeding North Korea's exports, which means that basically this is being financed from somewhere, probably from China. And the story is, of course, as we know, this dramatic increase in the share of North Korea's trade, which is concentrated in the bilateral relationship with China. And so if you go back to 2000, which is relatively recent in the longer scheme of things, you can see that the Japanese, South Korean, and Chinese share of North Korean trade was about the same at 20%. But then partly as a result of the sanctions, not simply as a result of the rapid growth of China, but as a result of the sanctions, you've seen this very dramatic increase in the Chinese share, which has fallen somewhat again in 2015, you would think. But then Kaesong has been closed as well. So the South Korean trade is set to basically go down to zero as well, making North Korea even more dependent on China than it previously was. So I'm going to start this longish answer to your question by just saying something about what U.S. expectations are with respect to the sanctions and how a negotiating strategy would fit into this. So the U.S. obviously is preoccupied primarily with the nuclear question. And the key question for the U.S. right now is basically, will Resolution 2270 be implemented? Because I think it's hard to read Resolution 2270 neutrally without anticipating that if fully implemented, North Korea would experience substantial, and I underline substantial, financial distress. It would basically experience something like a classic current account or balance of payments crisis. And so the U.S. is going to be watching for whether that kind of distress is in evidence, partly as an indicator of whether 2270 is in fact being implemented. Now, why do I think this? I think this because elements of 2270 mark a quite substantial change from previous Security Council resolutions in that they go after China's commercial trade. And if you look at past resolutions, China's been very careful to stay away from North Korea's commercial trade, emphasizing things that are tied directly to the weapons program and some other sanctions as well, but basically tied very closely to the weapons program. And now, for example, there's in principle a complete ban on the export of coal, which accounts for about 35 to 40% of North Korea's exports. So it's just extremely difficult for me to imagine that being fully implemented without North Korea experiencing this very substantial distress. And that's in addition to the shipping provisions, the financial provisions, and the closure of Kaesong, which have become, have also come at roughly the same time. And I should add that the risks of losing that amount of trade are not simply the income that it generates from the regime as the ultimate holders of these assets, but in the effect it would have on the exchange rate. And so if this were to be implemented as in Iran, you could imagine this very dramatic depreciation of the yuan, which would have substantial humanitarian impact across a number of North Korean households. So then the question becomes, if we're not seeing this kind of distress, what's the next step that the United States could do to bring pressure on the North Koreans to get negotiations going again? And I think the big tactical question is going to be whether we use secondary sanctions against Chinese firms in order to enforce these primary sanctions, which are outlined in 2270. And the answer to that question is partly a technical one, which is whether the Treasury has adequate information on Chinese firms to designate firms that need access to the American financial market in order to operate. And the second question, which is more of a political question, is do we want to pick this fight with China? And I think that the comments that Secretary Kerry made at Hiroshima reflect a willingness to allow these sanctions to be implemented in a gradual way that would put the United States right now in a position of kind of waiting to see Chinese intent before we have to do anything. And so this is a sort of long-winded way to answering your question, Tom. I'm sorry for providing this kind of background, but I think that the Chinese perspective on this whole process is that we have delivered 2270, and as a result of that, it's the United States' turn to pick up the ball on this and to make some moves that get us back in the direction of an actual negotiation through the six-party talks or through a peace regime format. And the United States' position is, well, until we see evidence that North Korea is interested in this process, that the United States is really under no diplomatic obligation to move. And so I think that's the answer to that question will depend on whether the implementation of this resolution has adequate material effect for North Korea to start floating more concrete proposals about reopening the six-party talks.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to turn back to. If you could go to your previous slide, because this is shares.
Yeah.
But this is dollars and exports.
Right.
Well, if you read the newspapers, I think the past day or two, the largest coal mining operating company, Peabody, went into bankruptcy. So a lot of this, I think a lot of this increase, it's all China, the increase in trade. So it's not really with the rest of the world. It's not like North Korea is engaging the rest of the world in economic activity. But this was also the time of the commodity super cycle. It was also the time of rapid Chinese economic growth before they went through this rebalancing process, which is going on now. And China will reduce excess capacity in the steel industry, which uses the anthracite coal, and other basic industries. So North Korea would have been squeezed anyway, just for global economic conditions. Then on top of that, the way I look at it, it looks like the Chinese are getting serious. You and Mark Nolan in your blog on on April 11th, or positioning themselves to get serious. Note that China's the Ministry of Commerce, right, MOFCOM, has made a detailed list of sanctions of products that are to be sanctioned, and down to the product level, 25 products, ores, rare earth minerals, for example. And there's an announcement in the General Administration of Customs on how to implement these embargoes. Now, of course, this still takes amount of will, and there could be forbearance. But when there are exceptions, I understand these exceptions have to be documented. So if a Chinese firm is trading in ores with North Korea, they have to say, well, we have this special exception. So there's a lot more transparency. And I think this would, if nothing else, add to the cost of trade with North Korea, probably add to the desire of North Korea to get around this and pay more in corruption, which corrupt fees and stuff like that. So anyway, but how do you when you look more closely at China's attitude, it seems like you almost said you see a fundamental shift. Is there a fundamental shift? Is China willing to start to tighten the screws on North Korea.
You made something that actually provides me an opening to say just a little bit about a little bit more about North Korea's trade. As you pointed out, North Korea's trade with the rest of the world has really fallen virtually to zero. And I think that's in part because it's been extraordinarily difficult for them to secure financing for that trade from anywhere, because no one trusts the North Koreans with respect to running a current account deficit. But the other thing we've done is we've looked at the relationship between North Korea's trade with China and mineral prices. So the green dotted line here is just North Korea's commercial merchandise exports. And the red and blue lines are just international commodity price indices. And one of the things you notice is that there's just this very close correlation between the increase in trade and prices of these commodities, which have sort of now turned down. So I think that the observation that North Korea is vulnerable to a squeeze here is not only coming from the sanctions, but is coming from this changed environment, which includes the slowdown in China, but also the slowdown in commodity prices. Now, the question is whether China has gotten serious or not. And as I said, I think the United States is going to be watching this. And Secretary Kerry's comments suggested to me a willingness to allow China to move at its own speed. But frankly, I don't see the logic of China agreeing to a resolution, despite the caveats in the resolution, in the form of UN Security Council 2270, and then turning around and basically saying, we have no intention of doing any of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, this just honestly doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I think we have to take China at its word. Mm-hmm. But they've also negotiated UN Security Council 2270 in such a way that they can exercise substantial discretion over how they do this. And I should say, I mean, unless you're a regime change type, and I again think that this is very unlikely that North Korea is going to collapse or disappear from the face of the earth, the objective of the sanctions, and the Chinese have stated this repeatedly, is not to create a crisis in North Korea. It's just to send an adequate signal to North Korea of China's capacity to do so that it would send a signal back that it was interested in negotiating on the nuclear question. And I have to say that to date, and Lee Siegel's here, who's actually influenced my work on this in quite substantial degree, even when the two of us disagree, I just haven't seen much interest on the part of North Korea in returning to nuclear talks. And most of the proposals that they've floated, and we can talk about these in more detail, they're actually quite interesting, have emphasized the importance of negotiating a peace regime first. Mm-hmm. And I think that, no United States president is going to sit down with the North Koreans and negotiate a peace regime prior to at least some sort of commitment to move forward on the nuclear question, and probably more than that, some progress on the nuclear question.
Okay. Well, so, I mean, just global economic pressures are tightening the screws on North Korea's government. Maybe China's positioning itself to do this. What will be North Korea's response? The May Party Congress is coming up the Party Congress will be held in May. I think for the first time in 36 years. These are held on a regular basis in China. The Byung-Jin doctrine is balancing, I guess, military development with economic development. But do you see any prospects for this balance to be achieved? Do you expect that that Pyongyang will actually make some meaningful steps in economic reform?
Well, there are a lot of questions packed into that. So let me start with a more general observation about North Korea. I think because North Korea has managed to survive for so long, we tend to think of them as being extremely savvy. But I think it's not impossible that the North Korean leadership has actually miscalculated quite substantially in this recent period. And let me suggest how that might have taken place. If you look at North Korea, the first thing I think we have to remember is that this is still a country that's undergoing a political succession. And a succession in this kind of personalist regime obviously involves Kim Jong Un having to pay attention to the military. And I mean, this just is not surprising. You would expect that, given the fact that this is a highly militarized state, it's one that has a very large security apparatus, it's extraordinarily authoritarian, that making sure that he has bases of support in the military is a key aspect of the succession. But beyond that, he's also chosen a domestic political strategy emphasizing the centrality of the nuclear and missile program to North Korea's very identity. Mm-hmm. And the Byungjin line essentially inscribed this by saying that he believed that he could simultaneously pursue economic development and nuclear weapons. And because North Korea is a small open economy, I think that that's basically not possible to do, because the ultimate transformation of the North Korean economy is going to hinge on it opening to the rest of the world, even more so than under the Chinese path. And we can maybe have a more extended discussion of this during the Q&A, but even though I use the Chinese reform model as a sort of shorthand for what North Korea needs to do, there are structural features of that economy that make it somewhat different, that they would follow a sequence that's like North Korea. In particularly because the advantages of undertaking reforms in the agricultural sector are just not going to yield the same kind of effect as they did in China. And so reform and opening, which is of course a Chinese phrase, is much more significant for North Korea to be fundamentally transformed than reforms of the agricultural, even the state-owned enterprise sector. And now it's telling to me that North Korea doesn't think there's a contradiction between economic development and nuclear weapons. But I think there's a contradiction between those two, because it's clear that foreign investors are not going to go into a place which not only has extraordinarily weak economic institutions and rule of law, but is also pursuing a strategy of nuclear weapons that makes it an unattractive place to invest. And so, again, this gets to this question of whether miscalculations are in play, because Kim Jong Un may believe that circle can be squared, but if the Chinese are not going to continue to support the North Koreans, and the North Koreans are completely dependent on the Chinese for such support, then, and they start to put those screws on, then where is he going to turn in terms of developing alternative sources of income effectively for the country? And I just don't see a lot of options. I mean, all these bridges have been burned. I mean, again, look back to this, this figure. Trade with the rest of the world is basically down to nothing. And so the capacity of the country to diversify on short notice to other sources of income just strikes me as extremely limited.
Mm-hmm. Are there, I overheard you this morning, and I hear this we had a Kim Gu Foundation series here. You were talking about at the micro level, or at the that there are seminars with government officials, and they seem to be very attentive to when outsiders talk to them about lessons from other countries that have had economic reform. I don't know if you had any experience with these exchanges, but what do you make of this? Is there any hope that there could be bottom-up reform percolating through the system?
Well, the term bottom up is actually apropos of some other things I wanted to say, because in the context which you've just talked about, you could mean bottom up in the sense of mid-level managers who are more attuned to these issues, feeding ideas up through the top. And my experience of that is that likelihood is extremely low. We had a group of North Koreans come through San Diego. I had a chance to lecture them about just the history of the Asia Pacific, how other countries in the region had developed. And it wasn't because I was so sterling. I mean, you could hear a pin drop in that room because there was tremendous interest in these issues. But when it came to the question of whether they could speak independently on issues of reform, it's complete silence. Mm-hmm. And that's clearly dictated at the top. Now, there's another meaning of reform from below, which Mark and I kind of coined this term, marketization from below, which is that marketization would occur not through a process of top-down reforms where the government announces a change in policy with respect to the agricultural sector, a change in policy with respect to state-owned enterprises, but that the government would simply allow households, firms, work units to engage in commercial activity in a way which has the effect of a kind of de facto reform. And my view, and it's not just my view alone, I think it's the view of the Korea Watchers community, is that number one, this has been going on since the famine, when households were more or less forced to do that. But the thing that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years that I think is interesting is that these activities have started to scale up. And you're starting to see the emergence of something that really looks like a North Korean capitalist class, a so-called Donju class. And why do we think this is true? Because we're getting reports of things like markets in real estate. And if you have markets in real estate, you've got people who've got either have substantial accumulated assets to be able to make these purchases, or there's a functioning black financial market which is doing more than just exchanging won for dollars. It's actually intermediating, financial flows. And so people are lending money to other people for financial and commercial purposes. Restaurants, we think a restaurant, why is a restaurant something that would be seen as a significant marker of economic reform? Well, the reason why is because a restaurant has an address. I mean, that's an expropriable piece of property. So the fact that someone's willing to invest in a restaurant is an indication that they at least have figured out some way that they can survive in an environment which is very rapidly changing. Let me just show you some, I think you've all seen pictures of this sort. This is, I'm just scrolling through things here to get to something. Oops. I thought I had some pictures here of this market activity, but I think I might have taken them out. But the point is that, the market started as these very small scale operations. I mean, think of a classic market, someone selling fruit. And then some of that moved indoors as the Koreans built structures that would permit trade in retail products and even in food. But now, again, we've moved upscale where there are wholesale activities and larger types of activities which suggest, that some de facto marketization process is taking place on a larger scale. Now, why is all this germane to the discussion of engagement? Because this group of actors has a stake in the trade with China and the economy continuing to be open, because these markets are basically fed in large part through the trade with China and investment from China. And so if these restraints were to be exercised by Chinese, you're not just affecting the coal industry, you're affecting the ability of the country to trade and to engage in this kind of commercial activity, which has grown over time. So another more simple way of putting this is I just think that North Korea has become much more open than people think. It really should be thought of as a small open economy, which is actually much more vulnerable to sanctions than it was 15 years ago.
That reminds me something about the progress of reform in China. Now, these people who are owning restaurants, investing in whatever they're investing in, food stalls or whatever, are they members of the Workers' Party? Even in the case of China, it wasn't until I think it was the 14th Party Congress under Jiang Zemin where he basically had the Chinese equivalent of the Emancipation Proclamation, where capitalists can be members of the Communist Party. They could be co-opted into the Communist Party. So if these people aren't involved in making party decisions or influencing what will go on the next party Congress, my question would be, to what extent do you think that these people can change the system to make it more amenable to engagement with the outside world?
Yeah, well, again, the type of evidence we have on these kind of things is indirect. So I'm going to be speaking off, 2 or 3 bodies of evidence. One is a set of firm-level surveys that we did right at the peak of the 6-party process success, which is 2007, 2008. Both Chinese firms and then a little after that, South Korean firms. And I can say something about how they responded to the way that they interacted with North Korean officials. So the first observation is that, of course, the households that are engaged in this kind of marketization activity are not necessarily members of the party. I mean, these are just households that are surviving. The second observation is that the larger the scale of the activity, the more significant it is that it's protected in some way. And that means one of two things. Either it's happening under the shell of existing state-owned enterprises, where a state-owned enterprise manager who is essentially assigned and given that position by the party is working in tandem with someone who has financial assets and entrepreneurial capability who is outside the party, forming a kind of fused enterprise in which the assets of the state are effectively being leased for semi-private use. Now, obviously, someone has to endorse this whole project, and that means it has to be protected in some way. And one of the things we think is going on is that lower level officials at the provincial or lower level are seeing this as in their advantage and are engaging in this kind of cooperative ventures with these quasi-private actors who are in turn paying, I mean, you can call it corruption or you can just call it leasing fees to these entities. And then the higher levels of the government, their attitudes towards this stuff is extraordinarily ambivalent because they can see that it's having positive growth effects, but they may not necessarily be in the loop of the returns on those activities. And the reason we know this is because you see reports of so-called audit teams being sent down to these enterprises and some of them being shut down. And again, this is drawn from very small samples of defector interviews of people who are defecting and have been involved in these kinds of enterprises and are reporting on the nature of those activities. But we certainly have enough anecdotal evidence to believe that this is a widespread practice which is going on.
Yeah. I think this is very, very fascinating. To put this in a broader context, the Heritage Foundation and the Wall Street Journal puts out an economic freedom index. And Nick Eberstadt referred to this in his op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal at the end of December, titled The World's Worst Economy. But for all this stuff to really make a difference in an economy, you need property rights, you need freedom from corruption so that your investment is predictable and secure over the longer term. And in regard to the whole score sheet for economic freedom, North Korea scores 178 out of 178 countries. The next country is Zimbabwe. But even Zimbabwe, despite its hyperinflation, which seems to have been much worse than what you showed me this morning in North Korea, still is engaging the IMF currently. I mean, there is, who knows whether this will be successful. Very challenging, but it's these features that I would look at least in the party Congress, to see whether North Korea is serious about economic reform, whether they start to institutionalize it on the country level.
Well, I don't want us to be too much in agreement, so let me poke back at this a little bit.
I'd be surprised if we were.
You know, I think as a general rule, if you're passing out advice, it's certainly a reasonable thing to suggest that property rights and capacity to contract and capacity to settle disputes through courts and so forth are good advice to give to developing economies. But, you know, if you look at the Chinese model, where's the rule of law there? Where are property rights there? Where is the right to contract there? And I think that these kinds of things can be embedded in systems that don't look like the standard Western system. Now, all that said, it does take a certain amount of forbearance on the part of the government to keep its fingers out of this stuff. Because if you look at virtually any of the reforms that have been discussed, such as allowing state-owned enterprise managers greater flexibility and profit, or even allowing farmers to keep a certain share of their harvest, if you're changing those rules ex post because something bad happens, then obviously in the next round, those actors are not going to respond in the same way. But I think that sad as it may be, it's possible that the North Korean economy, if the Chinese give it space, which of course is the big premise of the whole discussion here, it's possible that they could limp along in this kind of low-level equilibrium trap where this Danju class gets rich, businesses get formed, sometimes they get shut down, but other ones pop up. You can imagine a process like that going forward, which would at least have some positive effect. But the one thing it's not going to do, and I think the evidence on this is pretty strong, is it's not going to attract foreign direct investment from anywhere in the world outside of China. And so if you think that opening to foreign direct investment from places outside of China is critical for the success of North Korea's development, then I think that in particular just won't happen.
Yeah.
And, there's a sort of parchment illusion. I mean, you read North Korean documents, and they've issued plenty of documents about these these special economic zones. We've got the laws and so forth, but no one believes it because you're talking about a country which is, in the past shut down Kaesong. This time around, it was the South Koreans that did it. Last time, it was the North Koreans that did it. And that's expropriated the property of some of the largest foreign investors in the country, including Orascom, which we can talk about. It's a very interesting case about exactly how they expropriated Orascom's capital, but they've effectively expropriated this firm's earnings. And investors are just not going to go in that setting. And one of the things that's interesting in the most recent data is you do see a shrinking of the Chinese current account deficit or surplus, suggesting that financing from China, in fact, has been constrained in this most recent period as firms look over their shoulder at what's going on in the sanctions environment, but also, ask serious questions about whether they can operate in the North Korean environment.
Well, please join me in thanking both of these speakers, our moderator and our speaker today.